The year was 612 CE, and the Persian Empire stretched like a golden serpent across the known world. From the Mediterranean shores to the edges of India, Emperor Khosrau II commanded the loyalty of millions, controlled the richest trade routes ever known, and wielded an army that had never tasted defeat in 3 decades of conquest. But on a cold autumn morning in the mountains of Cappadocia, that empire was about to learn a lesson in warfare that would echo through military academies for the next 1,000 years. General Bahram stood at the edge of the Byzantine frontier, surveying the rocky terrain with practiced eyes. Behind him, the greatest military force ever assembled for a single campaign stretched for miles. 40,000 heavy cavalry, 30,000 archers, 20,000 siege engineers, and another 30,000 infantry. 120,000 men, the largest invasion force the Persians had ever committed to the Western territories. Their mission was simple: crush the last Byzantine resistance in Anatolia, open the gates to Constantinople, and end the Roman legacy forever. General, his second-in-command approached, bowing slightly. The scouts report the fortress of Castra ahead, just as intelligence predicted: isolated, undermanned, and poorly supplied. Bahram smiled. Castra, a name that meant nothing to history, a fortress that would be forgotten within a generation. According to their spies, it held no more than 600 defenders, Byzantine soldiers who had been abandoned by the retreating empire, left to die as a token resistance while Constantinople evacuated its treasures and nobility. 600 men, Bahram mused aloud, against our 120,000. His commander replied confidently. No rational commander would throw away lives so meaninglessly. But Bahram had been a soldier for 30 years. He had learned to trust his instincts, and something about this felt wrong. The fortress sat in an impossible position, nestled in a narrow mountain pass where the peaks rose like jagged teeth on either side. The only approach was a valley floor barely wide enough for his army to march in columns 20 men wide. "Why didn't they abandon this position?" Bahram asked quietly. "Every other garrison pulled back weeks ago. Why stay here to die?" His commander shrugged. "Pride? Stupidity? Does it matter? By sunset tomorrow, Castra will be ashes and we'll be through to the coastal plains." Bahram gave the order to advance. The massive Persian army began its march into the valley, their banners rippling like rivers of crimson and gold. The sound of 120,000 men marching created a rhythm like distant thunder, armor clanking, horses snorting, wagon wheels creaking under the weight of siege equipment. The Persian Empire had spent 2 years planning this campaign. The logistics alone were staggering. Supply lines stretching back hundreds of miles, coordinating the movement of thousands of horses, ensuring adequate food and water for an army that consumed resources like a locust swarm. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, except one. They had not considered that a Byzantine commander might be willing to die just to kill them all. As the Persian vanguard entered the valley, Bahram noticed something odd about the rock formations. The mountains on either side showed signs of recent rockfall, fresh scars on the cliff faces, debris that hadn't yet been worn smooth by wind and weather. It could be natural erosion, the kind of thing that happened in mountain regions all the time. But something nagged at him. Something wasn't right. "Send scouts to examine those cliff faces. I want to know if there's any risk of avalanche." His second-in-command looked skeptical. "General, we're fighting 600 men in a fortress. Even if half the mountain fell, we'd still outnumber them 200 to 1. "Humor me," Bahram replied tersely. But by the time the scouts could be organized and sent out, the army's momentum had already carried them deep into the valley. Thousands of men were already past the point where the mountains showed those suspicious signs of fresh rockfall. Stopping the advance now would create a logistical nightmare, trying to reverse the flow of 120,000 men in a confined space. Bahram made the calculation that countless generals before him had made. The risk of stopping seemed greater than the risk of continuing. He had faced mountain warfare before. Rockfalls happened, but they were localized, manageable, nothing that could truly threaten an army this size. He couldn't have been more wrong. Inside Castra's walls, Commander Marcus Therion watched the approaching army with absolutely no expression on his weathered face. At 43 years old, he had served the Byzantine Empire for 26 years, fought in 17 major battles, and survived 12 wounds that should have killed him. The soldiers called him the Stone, because nothing seemed to shake him, not the sight of overwhelming enemies, not the screams of dying men, not the collapse of empires. "Sir," his young lieutenant Alexios approached, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "The count is confirmed, 120,000, maybe more." Marcus continued watching the valley below, saying nothing. "Sir," Alexios pressed, "we should surrender. We can negotiate terms. They'll let us—" "They'll kill us all," Marcus interrupted calmly. "Emperor Khosrau gave the order months ago. No Byzantine prisoners. Every soldier is to be executed as a message to Constantinople. Surrender means death. Fighting means death. But only one of those options has a chance of meaning something." Alexios looked pale. "Chance? Sir, we're 600 against over 100,000. That's not a chance, that's suicide." Marcus finally turned to face him, and Alexios saw something in his commander's eyes that made his blood run cold. Not fear, not madness, but a crystalline clarity that somehow felt more terrifying than any emotion. "Tell me, Alexios, you studied at the military academy. You read the old histories. What do you remember about the Battle of Thermopylae? The 300 Spartans who held the pass against the Persians? They didn't hold it," Marcus corrected. "They died there. Every single one of them. And yet we're still talking about them 1,300 years later. They lost the battle but won something far more valuable. They proved that courage matters, that impossible stamps matter, that sometimes 6 men defending a bridge are worth more than 60,000 in open field." He gestured toward the valley below, where the Persian army continued its relentless advance, a river of steel and flesh flowing towards them. The Spartans had one advantage we don't have. They were defending a narrow coastal pass where the Persian numbers didn't matter. Here, the valley is wider. Eventually, they'll surround us, overwhelm our walls, and it will be over. "Then why fight at all?" Alexios asked desperately. Marcus smiled then, a cold, calculating smile that held no warmth. "Because I didn't choose this position to make a last stand. I chose it to make them disappear." The younger man stared at him, not understanding. Marcus walked to the edge of the wall, looking down at the valley floor where Persian soldiers were beginning to mass for their assault. 3 years ago, when I took command here, I asked myself the question, what could 600 men accomplish against an empire? The answer, by any conventional military thinking, was nothing. We're too few, too isolated, too poorly equipped. Any competent general would have evacuated this position months ago. Then why didn't you? Because I'm not trying to win a battle, Alexios. I'm trying to win a war. And sometimes winning a war means losing everything in the right place, at the right time, in the right way.
To understand what happened at Castra, you have to understand Marcus Therion's mind. A mind that thought about warfare the way a chess master thinks about the board, always seeing 3 moves ahead, always understanding that victory and defeat are just words that historians use to describe outcomes that mean nothing to dead men. Marcus had grown up in Thessalonica, the son of a military engineer and a teacher of philosophy. His childhood was spent drawing diagrams of walls and aqueducts, while his mother read him Plato and Aristotle. By the time he was 12, he could calculate load-bearing capacities for siege towers. By 15, he had memorized every major battle in Byzantine and Roman history. But it was his mother's teaching that shaped his true weapon, the understanding that warfare wasn't about bravery or strength. It was about perception, psychology, and making your enemy believe a lie so completely that they destroyed themselves trying to prove it wrong. The greatest generals, his mother once told him, are not the ones who win the most battles, They are the ones who make their enemies fight the wrong war in the wrong place at the wrong time. Make your enemy believe they are strong where they are weak, and they will rush to prove their strength straight into destruction. Those words haunted Marcus throughout his military career. He watched as Byzantine generals made the same mistakes repeatedly, meeting Persian forces in open battle where numbers mattered, defending positions that couldn't be held, retreating when they should attack, and attacking when they should retreat. The problem, Marcus realized, was that everyone was fighting yesterday's war. They were still thinking in terms of ancient tactics, shield walls and cavalry charges and siege engines. But warfare was evolving, and the commanders who would survive were the ones who could think beyond the established rules. When Marcus took command of Castra 3 years earlier, it was supposed to be a routine assignment, garrison duty at a backwater fortress that no one cared about. The previous commander had spent his time drinking and complaining about being exiled to nowhere. The fortress was undermanned, poorly maintained, and strategically irrelevant. But Marcus immediately saw what others had missed. The valley wasn't just a valley. It was a carefully sculpted geological trap, and the fortress wasn't positioned at its entrance by accident. He spent the first month simply studying the terrain. He climbed the mountains, examined the rock formations, traced the paths of ancient water channels, and slowly he began to see the pattern. The valley had been formed by millennia of water erosion, but not in the usual way. The water hadn't carved through the rock, it had carved beneath it. Underground rivers had hollowed out massive caverns in the mountain, creating enormous voids beneath what appeared to be solid stone. The mountains were essentially shells, held up by compression and structural integrity that was far more fragile than it appeared. Marcus spent Byzantine gold, his own salary, and borrowed funds he would never be able to repay, bribing geologists and mining engineers to come study the rock. He brought in specialists from Constantinople, from Athens, even from Persia itself under false pretenses. He told them he was planning to expand the fortress, that he needed to understand the local geology for construction purposes. What he was really doing was building a weapon. The geologists confirmed what Marcus suspected. The mountains on either side of the valley were structurally compromised. They had been slowly weakening for centuries, and it would take surprisingly little force to trigger a catastrophic collapse. The key was knowing exactly where to apply that force. Marcus spent the next 2 years mapping every crack, every fault line, every place where the rock was held together by nothing more than habit and hope. He created detailed diagrams that looked more like architectural blueprints than military plans. He calculated angles of force, compression ratios, the physics of cascading structural failure. And then he began to prepare his trap. The black powder came from a dozen different sources, acquired over months of careful trading and smuggling. Chinese merchants brought some, claiming it was for fireworks. Persian smugglers sold him barrels of it, thinking he was a Byzantine noble with a taste for exotic weapons. He bought small amounts from countless traders, never enough to attract attention, always paying in gold he could barely afford. By the end of the second year, Marcus had accumulated nearly 4,000 pounds of black powder, enough to demolish a city wall if used properly. But he wasn't planning to demolish a wall. He was planning to bring down 2 mountains. The placement was everything. Marcus and his most trusted engineers, men he had sworn to secrecy with oaths that bound their families for generations, spent months placing the charges in precisely calculated locations. They weren't trying to create one massive explosion. They were creating a network of smaller explosions that would trigger a chain reaction of structural failure. Each charge was placed in a natural cave or crevice, hidden from view and protected from moisture.
Each one was positioned at a stress point in the rock, a place where the mountain's weight was concentrated on a relatively small area. The charges were connected by a network of fuses that Marcus's engineers had tested dozens of times, calculating burn rates and timing with obsessive precision. The genius of the design was that it didn't rely on the explosives to destroy the army directly. The black powder was simply the trigger. Once the structural integrity of the mountains collapsed, gravity would do the rest. Millions of tons of rock would fall, driven by nothing more than the Earth's own weight. "You're building a weapon that will kill us all," his chief engineer said quietly one night as they worked by lamplight in the caves beneath the fortress. "Yes," Marcus replied simply. "And you're at peace with that?" Marcus paused in his work, looking at the complex network of fuses and charges that they had created. "Peace? No, but I understand the mathematics. 600 lives against 120,000 enemy soldiers. A doomed garrison against an invasion force that threatens our entire civilization. The equation is simple. There's no honor in suicide," the engineer said. "There's no honor in anything," Marcus replied. "Honor is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless acts. What matters is effect, not intention. What matters is whether our deaths accomplish something that our lives could not." The engineer shook his head. "You're asking these men to die for an empire that abandoned them. Constantinople pulled back every other garrison. They left us here to die. They left us here because they thought we didn't matter. And in conventional terms, they were right. 600 men can't stop 120,000. But 600 men in the right place, with the right preparation, can change everything." He stood up, brushing dust from his hands. "In 3 months, maybe 6, the Persian Empire will commit everything to one final push against Constantinople. They'll send their largest invasion force ever assembled. And by pure chance, or perhaps divine planning, that force will march through this valley."
How can you know that? Because it's the only route that makes sense, Marcus said. The coastal route is too easily defended. The southern pass is too narrow for an army this size. This valley is the only approach that can accommodate a force of 100,000 or more. They'll come through here because they have to. The engineer looked skeptical. "And if you're wrong? If they take a different route and we waste our lives on an empty trap?" Marcus smiled grimly. "Then we die as forgotten soldiers in a forgotten fortress, and history never knows we existed. But if I'm right, we become the weapon that breaks an empire's back." Over the final months, Marcus drilled his men relentlessly. Not in conventional combat, that would be useless against the numbers they faced, but in precise timing and coordination. Every soldier had a specific role in the plan. Some would man the walls to create the illusion of conventional defense. Others would operate the fuse mechanisms that would trigger the explosives in sequence. A few would serve as spotters, monitoring the Persian advance and calculating when the maximum number of enemy soldiers were in the kill zone. The key, Marcus explained to his officers in countless strategy sessions, is making them believe they're winning. If we fight too hard, they'll be cautious. If we surrender too easily, they'll be suspicious. We need to provide exactly the right amount of resistance, enough to make them commit their full force, not enough to make them pull back and reconsider. It was psychological warfare at its most refined. Marcus was orchestrating a performance, and every one of his 600 men was an actor playing a role designed to lure an empire to its death. General Bahram's advance into the valley proceeded exactly as planned. His vanguard reached the fortress walls by mid-afternoon, and the Byzantine defenders put up exactly the kind of resistance he expected. Desperate, fierce, but ultimately futile. Arrows flew from the fortress walls, killing dozens of Persian soldiers.
Small sorties by Byzantine cavalry harassed his flanks, then retreated back behind the walls. It was textbook defensive warfare, the kind Bahram had seen and overcome 100 times before. "They're fighting well," his second-in-command observed, "for a doomed garrison." "All men fight well when they're about to die," Bahram replied. "It's instinct. It means nothing." He gave orders for the siege engines to be brought forward. Massive towers, battering rams, catapults, the full arsenal of Persian siegecraft. Behind him, the army continued to flow into the valley like a river of men and steel, filling the narrow space completely. This was the moment when Bahram should have felt uncomfortable. His entire force was compressed into a geological bottleneck, with mountains rising steeply on both sides. Any competent military strategist would recognize this as a vulnerability. But Bahram was facing 600 defenders. What could they possibly do against 120,000? From his position on Castra's highest tower, Marcus watched the valley fill with enemy soldiers like water filling a cup. His eyes tracked the Persian advance with the precision of an engineer measuring load capacity. 50,000 men in the valley? 60,000. 70,000. "Sir," Alexios reported, checking the sight lines they had established months ago, "the rear guard is still entering. Another 30 minutes until the full force is committed." Marcus nodded, saying nothing. His mind was running through the calculations one final time, double-checking every variable. Wind speed and direction? Minimal. Wouldn't affect the explosion significantly. Temperature? Cold enough to make the rock more brittle, which would help. Cloud cover? Thick enough to muffle sound from distant observers. Everything was as close to perfect as it could be. 80,000. 90,000. 100,000. The Persian assault intensified. Siege towers rolled forward, their massive wheels crushing anything in their path. Battering rams carried by teams of 20 men pounded against Castra's main gate with rhythmic force. Ladders went up on every section of wall, Persian soldiers climbing in waves that seemed endless. The Byzantine defenders fought back with everything they had. Boiling oil cascaded from the walls, burning men alive. Arrows found gaps in armor, dropping soldiers from ladders. Heavy stones were dropped on the battering ram crews, crushing men beneath hundreds of pounds of rock. But it was theater. All of it was theater. Marcus had positioned his best fighters on the walls, but he'd given them explicit instructions. Fight fiercely, but fight inefficiently. Waste arrows, miss shots that should hit. Create the appearance of desperate resistance without actually inflicting maximum casualties. The goal wasn't to stop the Persian assault, it was to encourage it. 110,000, 115,000, 118,000. "Sir," Alexios said, and there was a tremor in his voice now, "the rear guard has entered. The entire force is in the valley." Marcus looked down at the scene below. The valley floor had disappeared beneath a sea of Persian soldiers. They stretched from the fortress walls back for miles, packed so densely that they could barely move. The siege engines, the cavalry reserves, the supply wagons, everything was committed. General Bahram had brought his entire invasion force into the trap. He had no idea that he was about to be remembered for something entirely different. Inside the inner keep, Marcus stood with his remaining men. They had withdrawn exactly as planned, funneling the enemy assault along predetermined paths, allowing the enemy to believe they were winning when in fact they were simply gathering in the kill zone. Around him, 597 men stood in silence. 3 had died in the defensive fighting, real casualties from real combat. The rest were here, alive, about to make a choice that would echo through history. Marcus looked at their faces, old soldiers with gray in their beards, young men who had never known victory, veterans of battles that everyone else had forgotten, the unwanted, the overlooked, the abandoned. "Final count?" Marcus asked.
118,000, Alexandros reported, his voice surprisingly steady now. Some men find calm when the moment of action finally arrives, when all the waiting and fear crystallized into simple clarity. Almost their entire force is in the valley. General Bahram is still near the entrance with about 2,000 men, but everyone else is committed. Marcus had hoped they could get Bahram too, but 2,000 men near the entrance would likely survive the collapse. It couldn't be helped. You could never achieve perfection in warfare, only acceptable compromises. He walked to a small altar that had been set up in the keep. Nothing elaborate, just a simple stone with icons of saints who had died in service. Each man had placed a small token there over the past days, letters to families they would never see again, locks of hair, wedding rings, the small artifacts of lives that were about to end. "I won't insult you with grand speeches," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly in the stone chamber. "You know what we're doing and why. You've had weeks to leave, and you chose to stay. Each of you made that choice freely, knowing what it meant." He paused, looking at each face. "The Persian Empire thinks it's invincible. It thinks numbers are everything. It thinks 600 men are nothing compared to 120,000, and by every rule of conventional warfare, they're right. But we're not fighting conventional warfare. We're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to break an empire, and there's only one way to do that: take away what makes them strong, their army, their confidence, their belief that nothing can stop them." Marcus walked to where the fuse mechanism sat, a complex arrangement of fire, oil channels, and carefully measured rope that connected to 43 separate explosive charges buried throughout the mountains. In a few minutes, 118,000 Persian soldiers will cease to exist. The largest invasion force ever assembled will vanish, and the Persian Empire will learn that numbers mean nothing against preparation, will, and the willingness to pay the ultimate price. He looked around at his men one final time. "It's been an honor serving with you. History may never know your names, but we'll know. We'll know that 600 forgotten soldiers changed the fate of civilizations." No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Marcus lit the first fuse. The flame traveled along the rope, a small point of light moving through the darkness like a dying star. It reached the first charge, a carefully measured amount of black powder placed in a cavern 100 feet beneath the northern mountain face. The explosion was almost gentle at first, a muffled thump that sounded more like distant thunder than an instrument of apocalypse. Persian soldiers paused in their assault, looking around in confusion. What was that sound? Then the mountain began to speak. It started as a vibration, felt more than heard. General Bahram, still positioned near the valley entrance, felt the ground beneath his feet begin to shiver. His horse whinnied nervously, ears flat against its skull. "What?" Bahram started to say. The second explosion cut him off. This one was louder, sharper, coming from somewhere deep in the northern mountain face. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. Boom, boom, boom. The explosions weren't simultaneous. Marcus had calculated their timing precisely, creating a cascade effect that would propagate through the weakened mountain structure like a devastating wave. Each charge triggered the next, each explosion weakening the rock further, each detonation pushing the mountains closer to the edge of structural collapse. A crack appeared in the northern cliff face, a line of darkness spreading across the stone like lightning frozen in rock. Persian soldiers near the mounting began pointing, shouting warnings that were lost in the growing rumble. And then the world came apart. The northern mountain face gave way first. Billions of tons of rock held in place for millennia for nothing more than geological balance suddenly lost that balance. The entire mountainside began to slide, slowly at first, like a giant deciding to lie down, then with gathering momentum that turned slow motion into catastrophic speed. Persian soldiers looked up in absolute horror as the mountain came down on top of them. There was nowhere to run. The valley was packed with 118,000 men compressed into a space 7 miles long and barely 200 meters wide. They were trapped between advancing death and the bodies of their own army. The sound defied description. Imagine every thunderstorm you've ever heard happening simultaneously. Imagine the earth itself screaming. Imagine the sound of millions of tons of rock falling thousands of feet, crushing everything beneath it. Now multiply that by 1,000, and you might approach what the Persian army heard in their final moments. The southern mountain face followed 10 seconds later, triggered by the vibrations from the northern collapse. Now both sides of the valley were falling inward, millions upon millions of tons of rock creating an avalanche that blotted out the sun with dust and death. General Bahram, safe near the valley entrance with his 2,000 men, could only watch in frozen horror as his entire army, the pride of the Persian Empire, the largest invasion force ever assembled, simply vanished beneath the falling mountains. Men screamed, horses screamed, the rocks screamed, everything screamed, and then suddenly horribly stopped screaming as the avalanche buried them all. The collapse took 17 minutes. 17 minutes of continuous thunder as the mountains fell, as rock buried rock, as 118,000 men ceased to exist. 17 minutes that changed the course of history. When the dust finally began to settle, General Bahram sat on his horse at the valley entrance, staring at devastation beyond comprehension. Where there had been a valley, there was simply mountains. The entire geography had changed. What had been a low pass through the mountains was now just another peak, as if the valley had never existed. And somewhere beneath it all, beneath billions of tons of rock, beneath the new mountain that hadn't existed an hour ago, lay 118,000 Persian soldiers and 600 Byzantine defenders who had chosen to become ghosts that swallowed an empire's army whole.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The messenger reached Emperor Khosrow II's palace in Ctesiphon 3 weeks later. He was covered in dust, his face gaunt from riding non-stop across the empire, changing horses at every station, sleeping in the saddle when he slept at all. The message he carried would change the course of history. The imperial court was in full session when the messenger arrived, covered in the dust of 1,000 miles. He collapsed in the throne room, barely able to stand, his voice hoarse from dehydration and exhaustion. "The army is gone," he gasped, the words echoing in the sudden silence. "All of it. 118,000 men. General Bahram survived because he was still at the valley entrance. He watched the entire force disappear under the mountains. There are no survivors, no wounded, no stragglers. They're simply gone." The court erupted in chaos. Advisors shouted questions. Generals demanded clarification. The messenger's words made no sense. Armies didn't just disappear.
Even in the worst defeats, even when forces were completely routed, there were always survivors, always wounded, always men who fled the battlefield and trickled back to their units over the following weeks. But not this time. Khosrow II sat frozen on his throne, his face carved from marble. "What happened?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos with imperial authority. "Was it an earthquake? Divine punishment? Explain." The messenger took a shaking breath. "The Byzantine commander, a man named Marcus Therion. General Bahram's report says he brought the mountains down. Deliberately. He spent 3 years preparing the valley as a trap. He placed explosives in the mountains and waited until our entire army was committed. Then he collapsed both sides of the valley on top of them." The court fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of incomprehension. He killed himself? And his own men? "All 600 of them," the messenger confirmed. "They're buried under the same mountains." General Bahram saw the fortress collapse along with everything else. The Byzantine commander knew his garrison couldn't win, so he turned the valley into a tomb for both armies. Khosrow stood abruptly, his robes sweeping around him as he paced the throne room. His mind was racing through the implications, and each one was more devastating than the last. 118,000 soldiers, gone. Not killed in battle where their sacrifice might rally others, not defeated where they could retreat and regroup, simply erased. Buried under mountains where it could never be recovered or reused. "How many men do we have left?" Khosrow asked, his voice deceptively calm. His chief military advisor consulted his reports, his hands shaking slightly. "For the Western campaign, 23,000 in reserve garrisons scattered across our western territories. We could pull another 30,000 from the eastern frontiers, but that would leave us dangerously exposed to threats from the steppes. Perhaps another 20,000 could be conscripted from the provinces, but they would need months of training before they could be considered combat ready. So 70,000, Khosrow said flatly. Maybe. Against how many Byzantine defenders? Constantinople itself has at least 40,000 trained soldiers, and they're behind the strongest walls in the world. The Byzantine fleet controls the Bosphorus. Even with 70,000 men, if we could actually assemble that many, we couldn't take the city. We don't have the siege equipment, the naval support, or the supply lines. That was all supposed to come with the main army. The advisor's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. My emperor, the Western campaign is over. We've lost. Khosrow slammed his fist on the throne armrest, the first crack in his imperial composure. One fortress, one commander, 600 men. They stopped an empire. But the damage went beyond the military defeat. Over the following months, the economic implications became clear. The Persian Empire had spent enormous sums on this campaign, not just on weapons and armor, but on the logistics of moving 120,000 men across the empire. Trade routes had been disrupted, taxes had been raised, the imperial treasury had been drained. And all for nothing. Worse, the psychological impact rippled through every level of Persian society. The army was supposed to be invincible. For 30 years, Persian forces had conquered territory after territory, defeated enemy after enemy. The military might of Persia was the foundation of the empire's power, the guarantee of its security. And 600 Byzantine soldiers had destroyed it. Regional governors began to question their loyalty to an emperor who could lose 118,000 men in a single day. Border territories started testing their independence, wondering if the central government had the strength to enforce compliance. The Arab tribes to the south, who had been kept in check by fear of Persian military power, began raiding with new boldness. The empire didn't fall immediately. Empires never do. They crack slowly, fissures spreading from a single point of failure until the whole structure becomes unstable. But historians would later trace the beginning of Persia's collapse to a valley that no longer existed, where 600 men taught an empire that power built on numbers alone is no power at all. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire learned of the battle weeks later through their own intelligence networks. The initial reports were dismissed as impossible. Surely no commander would sacrifice his entire garrison just to kill enemy soldiers. But as more reports came in, always telling the same story, the Byzantine leadership began to understand what Marcus Therion had done.
Emperor Heraclius, who had been preparing for the inevitable fall of Constantinople, suddenly found himself with an unexpected gift: time. The Persian invasion had been stopped. Not defeated in the traditional sense. There had been no great battle, no triumphant victory to sing songs about, but stopped nonetheless. 10 years. That's what Marcus had purchased with the lives of his 600 men. 10 years for Constantinople to rebuild its defenses, reform its military, reorganize its economy. 10 years of breathing room that would prove critical to Byzantine survival. Heraclius gave orders for a monument to be built honoring the garrison of Castra, but the monument was never completed. There was too much else to do, too many immediate crises to address. The 600 defenders became a footnote in official histories, their sacrifice acknowledged but never properly commemorated. But among the military academies and officer corps, the story spread like wildfire. Young Byzantine officers studied the battle, if it could be called a battle, with obsessive detail. They analyzed Marcus Therion's strategy, his 3-year preparation, his psychological manipulation of the enemy, his willingness to sacrifice everything for a strategic objective. The concept revolutionized Byzantine military thinking. For generations, warfare had been about winning battles, defeating the enemy army, capturing territory, forcing surrender. But Marcus had demonstrated something different. Warfare as pure mathematics. 600 lives traded for 118,000 enemy soldiers. A doomed garrison turned into a weapon that saved an empire. Byzantine generals began incorporating deliberate retreats into their battle plans, luring enemies into prepared positions where geography itself became weaponized. The idea of making the enemy think they were winning until it was too late became a cornerstone of Byzantine tactical doctrine. 50 years later, when Arab armies besieged Constantinople with overwhelming numbers, Byzantine commanders used early forms of Greek fire, a devastating incendiary weapon, to create the same psychological effect Marcus had achieved with mountains. They let the Arab fleet approach, allowed them to commit their forces, then unleashed fire that couldn't be extinguished by water. Ships burned, men burned, and the Arab commanders learned what the Persians had learned, that sometimes the enemy who appears to be retreating is actually preparing your destruction.
The strategic impact of Castra extended even beyond Byzantine borders. Persian military intelligence had documented what happened, and those reports eventually made their way along the Silk Road to military academies in China, India, and even to the Islamic caliphates that would later rise to power. Chinese strategists added the Battle of Castra to their military texts, analyzing it alongside Sun Tzu's principles. They saw in Marcus Therion's strategy the ultimate expression of winning without fighting, by preparing so thoroughly that the battle itself became inevitable and one-sided. The concept of turning terrain into a weapon, of using the enemy's own momentum against them, became incorporated into Chinese military doctrine. In India, military theorists debated whether Marcus's sacrifice could be justified under Dharma, the concept of righteous duty. Some argued that deliberately dying was contrary to a warrior's obligation. Others countered that Marcus had fulfilled the highest form of duty, protecting the civilization he served at the cost of his own life. The debate continued for centuries, with military philosophers on both sides citing Castra as the ultimate test case for strategic ethics. But perhaps the most significant impact was on how empires thought about force projection. Before Castra, military power was measured in simple terms. How many soldiers could you field? How well equipped were they? How experienced were your generals? After Castra, military planners had to consider new variables. How vulnerable were your supply lines? What terrain would you be fighting in? Could your enemy have prepared the battlefield in ways you couldn't detect? Was the enemy's weakness actually bait for a trap? The Persian Empire never recovered its confidence. Even when they assembled new armies, Persian commanders were haunted by the memory of 118,000 men disappearing in a single afternoon. They became cautious, hesitant, always wondering if the next valley might be another trap. And that hesitation proved fatal. 30 years after Castra, when Arab armies surged out of the Arabian Peninsula in the early Islamic conquests, they found a Persian empire that had lost its will to fight. The same empire that seemed invincible in 612 CE collapsed with shocking speed, its military paralyzed by memories of what one clever commander could do to an army that believed in nothing but numbers. The Byzantine Empire, meanwhile, survived for another 800 years. It faced countless invasions, endless wars, political upheavals, and internal crises. But it endured, and historians would later argue that the empire's survival could be traced back to a single decision made by a forgotten commander in a valley that no longer existed. Marcus Therion had bought Constantinople 10 years with his life. But in doing so, he had purchased something far more valuable, a lesson that would echo through military strategy for the next 1,000 years. The lesson that warfare isn't about winning, it's about making the enemy lose in ways they never imagined possible.
The valley called Castra no longer appears on any map. The mountains fell so completely that they erased even the memory of geography. Centuries later, when travelers passed through the region, they would see only mountains, and never know that beneath their feet lay the largest mass grave in ancient history. Archaeological expeditions in the 19th and 20th centuries tried to locate the site, using historical records and geological surveys. They found nothing. The collapse had been so complete the burials so thorough that 118,600 men had simply vanished from the physical world. No artifacts, no remains, just mountains that showed signs of ancient rockfall that could have happened at any time in the past 10,000 years. But Marcus Therion's strategy didn't die with him. In military academies across the world, even today, the Battle of Castra is studied as the ultimate example of asymmetric warfare. Not asymmetric in the modern sense, guerrilla tactics and insurgent operations, but asymmetric in its purest form, creating conditions where conventional military power becomes a liability rather than an asset. Modern military strategists call it terrain as weapon or environmental warfare. The concept that you don't defeat the enemy through superior force, you defeat them by making their force work against them. You turn their strength into weakness, their numbers into vulnerability, their confidence into the instrument of their destruction. The principles Marcus employed are taught in every military academy. Preparation over reaction. Marcus spent 3 years preparing his trap. Modern special operations forces spend years preparing operational environments before conflicts even begin. They pre-position resources, map terrain, identify vulnerabilities, all so that when conflict comes, the battle is already half won before the first shot is fired. Psychology over force. Marcus understood that the real battle wasn't about killing 118,000 soldiers. It was about making them walk into position to be killed. Modern information warfare, deception operations, and strategic misdirection all trace their intellectual lineage back to commanders like Marcus, who understood that making the enemy believe a lie is more powerful than any weapon. Strategic sacrifice. This is the most controversial aspect of Marcus's legacy. He deliberately chose mutual destruction, 600 lives plus 118,000 enemy lives, because the strategic mathematics made sense. Modern military ethics still grapple with this question. When is it acceptable to sacrifice your own forces to achieve a strategic objective? The debate continues, but Castra remains the ultimate test case. In the 21st century, the concept of A2AD, anti-access area denial in modern military strategy, is essentially a high-tech version of what Marcus did at Castra. The idea is to create environments where an enemy's superior numbers and technology become useless or counterproductive. You don't fight the enemy where they're strong. You create conditions where strength doesn't matter. But beyond the tactical and strategic lessons, Marcus Therion's story resonates because it asks fundamental questions about purpose, sacrifice, and what truly matters in warfare. Marcus and his 600 men knew they were going to die. The Byzantine Empire had abandoned them. They had no hope of rescue, no chance of survival, no glory to win. They could have surrendered. They could have fled through the mountain passes. They could have simply waited for death to come to them. Instead, they chose to make their deaths mean something. That choice, the conscious decision to transform inevitable death into purposeful sacrifice, is what makes the story endure. It's not about bravery in the traditional sense. Marcus's men weren't heroes charging into battle with flags flying and trumpets blaring. They were forgotten soldiers making a cold mathematical calculation. Our lives are forfeit either way, so what can we purchase with them? The answer was 10 years of peace for millions, the survival of an empire, a lesson in warfare that would echo for 1,000 years. In 2011, archaeologists and geologists conducted a major survey of the Cappadocia region using ground-penetrating radar and other advanced technologies. They were looking for Castra, trying to finally locate the site of the legendary battle. What they found was unexpected. Deep beneath the mountains, the radar detected massive voids, ancient caverns that had been hollowed out by water over millennia. And in some of these caverns, they found anomalies, density irregularities that could be rockfall or could be something else. Organic materials, perhaps, preserved by the specific conditions of the collapse. The Turkish government denied permission for excavation. The site, if it was indeed Castra, would be too valuable as an archaeological treasure to risk damaging with exploratory digs. And perhaps there was another reason. Some graves are better left undisturbed. But the lead archaeologist on the project wrote a paper about the findings, and in it she included a striking observation. If the anomalies they detected were indeed organic remains, preserved bodies from the collapse, then the density and distribution suggested something unexpected. The Persian soldiers were scattered throughout the buried valley, distributed randomly by the chaos of the collapse. But the Byzantine defenders were concentrated in a single location, grouped together in what appeared to be the fortress's inner keep. They had died together, as they had chosen to die, in the exact positions Marcus Therion had planned them to occupy. Even in death, they had maintained their formation.
Today, military officers visiting Turkey sometimes make an unofficial pilgrimage to the Cappadocian region. They hike into the mountains, looking for the place where Castra might have stood. They don't find it. No one does. But that's not really the point. They're paying respects to a commander who understood something fundamental about warfare. It's not about winning or losing. It's about purpose. It's about making every action, every sacrifice, every death serve a strategic objective that transcends the individual. Marcus Therion and his 600 men lost the battle. They died, every single one of them, buried under mountains they themselves brought down. By any conventional measure, they were defeated. But they won the war. They saved their empire. They broke the enemy's will to fight. They purchased a decade of peace with the single afternoon of apocalyptic destruction. And in doing so, they created a legend that transcends victory or defeat, that asks us to reconsider what truly matters when civilizations clash and the fate of millions hangs in the balance. The mountains of Cappadocia stand today as they have for millennia, silent and seemingly eternal. Tourists visit them for their strange rock formations and ancient cave dwellings, never knowing what lies beneath their feet. But the mountains remember. They remember the day they became a weapon. They remember Marcus Therion, who looked at a valley and saw not terrain, but an opportunity to reshape history. They remember 600 men who chose purpose over survival, who calculated that their lives were worth exactly 10 years of peace and the destruction of an empire's invincibility. And they remembered the lesson that echoes through every military academy, every strategic planning session, every moment when commanders must choose between conventional wisdom and impossible tactics. Sometimes the greatest victory looks like defeat to everyone except those who understand what was truly being fought for. The Ghost Legion vanished from history, but they took an empire's army with them. And in doing so, they proved that 600 prepared men in the right place are worth more than 120,000 in the wrong one. That is the story of Castra, a battle that wasn't a battle, a defeat that was a victory, a sacrifice that saved a civilization, and a reminder that in warfare, as in life, what truly matters isn't how many times your heart beats. It's what you accomplish while it's still beating. The valley is gone. The fortress is gone. The men are gone. But the lesson remains, carved not in monuments or memorials, but in the strategic consciousness of everyone who studies warfare and asks themselves the fundamental question, what am I willing to become to serve my purpose? Marcus Therion answered that question by becoming a ghost that swallowed an empire. And history, though it may not remember his name in common conversation, remembers what he proved, that preparation, purpose, and the willingness to pay any price can overcome any odds. The Persian Empire had 120,000 soldiers, the finest weapons, the greatest generals, and absolute confidence in their inevitable victory. Marcus Therion had 600 forgotten men, 3 years of preparation, and the understanding that sometimes, to save everything, you must be willing to sacrifice everything. He chose sacrifice, and in that choice, he changed the world.
There's a question that military historians still debate when they discuss Castra, a question that has no easy answer. Was Marcus Therion a hero or a monster? He sacrificed 600 men who trusted him. He manipulated them into dying for a strategy they only fully understood at the very end. He spent 3 years preparing their deaths with the same cold precision an engineer uses to design a bridge. He turned human beings, his own soldiers, into components of a weapon. And yet, he saved millions. The 10 years he purchased allowed families to live in peace. Children were born, grew up, and never knew the terror of Persian invasion. Cities flourished, art was created, knowledge was preserved. The Byzantine Empire, given time to breathe, reformed itself and survived for 8 more centuries. How do you weigh 600 lives against millions? How do you judge a commander who saw his own men as pieces on a board to be sacrificed when the strategic mathematics demanded it? Perhaps the answer lies not in judgment, but in understanding. Marcus Therion didn't see himself as a hero. In his final moments, standing in that keep with the fuse burning in his hand, he wasn't thinking about glory or legacy. He was thinking about mathematics, about purpose, about the cold equation that said 600 lives could purchase something that no amount of conventional bravery could achieve. War forces impossible choices. It creates situations where every option is terrible, and the only question is which terrible option serves a purpose worth dying for. Marcus chose his terrible option. He spent 3 years preparing it. He lit the fuse with his own hand, and then he died, buried under the same mountains as his enemies, his name eventually forgotten by all but military scholars who study the geometry of sacrifice. The mountains of Cappadocia offer no answers. They simply stand, silent monuments to a day when one man looked at impossible odds and found a way to turn defeat into victory by understanding that sometimes the two are the same thing. 600 men, 118,000 enemies, one empire saved, one empire broken, and a lesson that echoes through the centuries.
In warfare, as in life, it's not the strength of your army that matters, it's the clarity of your purpose and your willingness to pay the price that purpose demands. The Ghost Legion is still there, beneath the mountains, waiting in the darkness with 118,000 Persian soldiers who learned too late that numbers mean nothing against preparation, will, and the mathematics of strategic sacrifice. They are the ghosts that broke an empire, and they are still teaching us, even now, what it means to understand the true cost of victory.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.